Scott Cummings. I teach here in the theater department at Boston College, and for those of you who I haven't met, I want to extend a special thanks for sticking around after today's performance for a somewhat unusual event for us, a panel discussion. We're very, very fortunate to have two special guests who I'd like to introduce to you in a minute, but in an effort to sort of bridge out of the play and into our discussion, which will focus on the subject of hunger. I just want to mention one or two things real quickly about the playwright, Dario Fo, who's responsible for We Won't Pay, We Won't Pay. Dario Fo is one of the most important men in 20th century Italian theater. He was born in 1926 in a small Italian town near Lake Maggiore. And he has spent a lifetime as a performer, storyteller, what we could call a theatrical minstrel, and a playwright, creating a very unusual brand of political theater that celebrates the trials and the triumphs of the downtrodden, the disenfranchised, and working people. Some of you may know that in 1997, Fo was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, which was a controversial decision. It was challenged by some who insisted that Fo was much more a man of the theater than he was a man of letters. Some people argued that his plays, strictly speaking, were not literature. But the Nobel Committee in its citation described him as, quote, one who emulates the gestures of the Middle Ages in scourging authority and upholding the dignity of the downtrodden. He, if anyone, merits the epithet of jester in the true meaning of that word. With a blend of laughter and gravity, he opens our eyes to abuses and injustices in society, and also the wider historical perspective in which they can be placed. Now, Fo's fight against injustice, principally in his native Italy, has continued right up to the present day. I wanted to give you a couple examples about that. Fo's most recent work for the theater debuted in December, just a couple of months ago, in London. It's a one-woman piece called Peace Mom. It's a theater piece based on the very famous American mother named Cindy Sheehan. Some of you may remember that last summer Cindy Sheehan encamped herself on the road leading to President Bush's ranch in Texas as a way of protesting her son's death in the war in Iraq. Dario Fo is in the process of creating a theater piece based on Cindy Sheehan's letters, and it had a sort of preliminary debut at a one-day conference in London in December. More recently than that, less than a month ago, Dario Fo lost his bid to become the mayor of Milan, Italy, his native Milan. He was in a primary election campaign, ironically running against a former chief of police in Iran, and at 79, there were some voters who were concerned about his preparation for the office, never having held political office before. He was defeated in that primary. We Won't Pay, We Won't Pay is by far one of Fo's most famous plays. Just so you know, it dates all the way back to 1974, where it premiered at the theater in Milan, run by Fo and his lifelong partner, and in life and in work, the woman named Franca Rame. Since 1974, the play has been performed all over the world. Unfortunately, the play is as relevant today as it was 30 plus years ago. And the particular injustice, as we know, at the heart of this play is hunger, what in some instances is called food security or food insecurity. And our panelists today are well positioned to address that issue. They are members, our panelists, of a broad community of researchers, scientists and social scientists, doctors and healthcare professionals, social workers, teachers, and humanitarians who are redefining what health is, what nutrition is, what hunger is. And we're very happy to have them here today. Between our two panelists, they have a perspective which ranges from a community perspective to a sort of municipal perspective on to a state level, a national level, and an international level. So they are very well positioned to address this question from all angles. Each of them has demonstrated a particular interest in children, and the relationship and the effects of hunger on children. They have dedicated a part of their professional lives to, in effect, trying to attack hunger at the source, trying to stop hunger before it sets into the lives of young people. All the way to my right is Ellen Parker. Ellen Parker is the executive director for the past 8 years, did you tell me, of Project BREAD. Project BREAD is a Boston-based organization which is dedicated to alleviating, preventing, and ultimately ending hunger in the state of Massachusetts. Project BREAD has many initiatives. They fund food banks all over the state. They operate a statewide food source hotline for people to call and find out about sources for food that they need. Project BREAD works with schools around the state to establish breakfast programs for low-income children in need. And one of the most best-known programs of Project BREAD is the first Sunday of each May, and some of you may want to put it on your calendars. Project BREAD sponsors and runs the annual Walk for Hunger, which is the oldest continual pledge walk in the nation. Under Ellen Parker's leadership, Project BREAD has emerged, gained national recognition as a new model for addressing the needs of the hungry on both a local and a statewide level. She herself has been recognized with a number of awards. On my immediate right is Dr. Bert Garza. Dr. Garza is a leading and extremely influential expert on health and nutrition, both domestically here in the U.S. and around the world. He has a particular interest in infant and child nutrition, which is manifest in his work to revise growth standards and dietary reference intakes, and to evaluate the safety of such things as infant formula and genetically engineered foods. He has served on a long list of advisory panels and working groups and research committees, just to name 2 of them that have some bearing on our topic today. He's the chair of the Technical Advisory Group of the United Nations World Food Program. The World Food Program is the food assistance arm of the United Nations. He's also a member of the Food and Nutrition Board of the National Academies of Science, which is a non-governmental organization that helps to shape the federal government's food and nutrition policy. And as many of you know, more recently, he has become the Associate Vice President and Dean of Faculties here at Boston College. Just since November, I believe, was the formal start date. Is that right?
That's right.
Right. Coming to us from distinguished careers at Baylor University and Cornell, and we are very happy to have him as a key leader on the campus community. If you ever wonder, is it possible to make a difference, we have as our guests today 2 people who are making a difference. And if you ever wonder if it's possible to change the world, we have 2 guests today who are changing the world. So please join me in welcoming Ellen Parker and Bill Clinton. Thank you. The way we're going to proceed today is to ask each of our panelists to make some opening remarks, talk for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes on the subject of hunger and their work in the field. And then we'll have some questions, first from me or perhaps from the director of our production, and then we'll open to the wider floor. So you might want to be thinking what particular questions you have that have some bearing on this issue of food, hunger, nutrition. So, Ellen?
Great, thank you so much. So I'm Ellen Parker, and I'm so glad to be here, and I'm thrilled that the actors in the production were here. I have to just tell you, you were wonderful. You were terrific teachers. You were extraordinary. A privilege to, I've learned a lot from you, so thank you for being my teachers, and you were just magnificent. And thank you to the production staff, the behind the scenes, the director. You just did a wonderful, wonderful job. It's really something that I'll remember, something very special for me. So I want to talk a little bit about what you did and tell you what it made me think about in terms of my own work. So the first thing I loved about it, because I'm an Irish Catholic girl from a Boston, and anyone who grows up as an Irish Catholic girl knows the whole subversive history of women in the church. So I love the mothers and the sisters and the whole really practical way that women deal with rules. And because women, of course, are so close to birth and to death, and to the activities of daily life, that we often have a much clearer perspective on what's right. We tend to be less ideological. I'm not sure if that's right, but that's what I heard. So I loved the subversive feminist quality of it. I just loved that part. And I was so reminded, I was the youngest of 3 girls, and my older sister, who reminded me so much of you, I have to tell you, would always say, "Shut up, you little ninny," because I'd be saying, "Oh, we're going to get in trouble, we're going to get in trouble." So I had like a huge sort of, so that's the real personal part of what I loved about the play. I also really loved the play because what it did is it defined the problem from the perspective of people who are suffering from the problem. And if I've probably done anything at Project Bread that I'm most proud of, it really is to understand hunger from the perspective of a person who's hungry. And that's what you did, and you did it so brilliantly and so well, because really, who defines the problem? Who defines hunger? Well, we have a lot of experts who define hunger, many of them brilliant experts, who define hunger, but we don't always hear about hunger from the perspective of a woman who has a couple of kids to feed and not enough money to get to the end of the month. And I always wonder, and I always say at Project Bread, would we have so many food pantries if we were really thinking about it from the perspective of the people waiting in line? I mean, we raised nearly $3 million at the Walk for Hunger. Now, who has been to the Walk for Hunger? Oh, more hands. Next time when I ask you that, in 2007, everyone will say they've been. And the Walk for Hunger is really wonderful. I mean, in its own way, it's a piece of theater. I mean, there's 40,000 people, it's 20 miles, we walk here past Bice, BC. It's extraordinary. It's a wonderful, wonderful event. We raise money for food pantries and soup kitchens, and in so many ways, it's an extraordinary, it's a blessing, and it's a help to people. But I always think, in the morning of the Walk for Hunger, when I see all of these people on Boston Common, and they're so excited, and they're so proud of themselves, as they should be, I think, like, who's sort of getting gratified when we run emergency programs that make poor people line up, and people who have resources are handing out resources. And I never can go to a food pantry or soup kitchen without thinking to myself, how would I feel to be standing there with my children? What would that make me feel like? Would I feel good? Or would I rather be in a supermarket? And in fact, sometimes when I'm on national panels and I follow someone who says, we have a hunger emergency in this country, and we need a good food system. And I always say we have a great food system. It's called the supermarket. And that's where people like to go food shopping, and that's where they like to go because they like to have choice, and they like to have a nutritional choice. So I thank you so much for really pointing out to us in the really extraordinarily wonderful, unboring way that theater does, what it means to be hungry from the perspective of the person who experiences that real injustice. And I think that just the final thing I want to say related to this is that at Project Bread, I think we're different from many anti-hunger organizations in the United States, because we constantly think about where are we on the continuum between charity and justice. That if we were just charity, we would be fine with people lining up for cheese. And I said to Bert earlier, I wonder if there's ever going to be cheese riots when those people line up at those trucks. I mean, just in keeping with the wonderful theater piece. And but we know that people need emergency food. But at the same time, there's a justice component of it. And I think from the perspective of a hungry person, we would rather, if I were hungry, I would rather have it be a justice issue because I wouldn't want to have to rely on the charity of other people. And it's always easier, I think, to give charity than to get charity. Getting charity is not nearly as pleasant as that good kind of shiny feeling you have when you give. Which isn't to say you shouldn't walk in the walk for hunger, because you should. Or you shouldn't raise money for Project Bread, because you should do that too. But always, I think we need to think, whenever we help people who we perceive to be less fortunate than us, we always need to think, what's it like to be standing there right in that person's shoes right now? And isn't it easier to be me? And I think that the answer to that is yes. I wanted to say two other quick things. Every year, Project Bread does a report to the community on hunger. So if I didn't get into the really serious substantive things that you were wanting me to get into, it's not that we don't have it at Project Bread, it's that I wanted to really reflect on the work that all of you did today. We have a website, which is projectbread.org, or you can just call us. We're right in beautiful East Boston, and you can just give us a call, and we'll send you out anything that we can. But thank you so much for having me. I'm so eager to hear your questions, and I am just so honored to be with all of you. Thank you.
I'm Bert Garza, as Scott told you, the ADP at Boston College. And I'd like to begin also by thanking everyone who was involved in the production. As an ADP, you certainly made me feel very proud of BC and the great work that each of you did in putting this together. I'd like to follow up on a comment that Ellen just made in terms of justice, because indeed that, for me, was the principal message of play. And as someone that's been very much involved, as Scott told you, in the whole food nutrition world of both as an academic and in other contexts, that it is one of the most, possibly the only commodity that really has a justice bearing that we limit in the way that we do. Because if you think of the two other things that humans can't do without, one is air and the other is water. Now we may think about shelter and fuel, but we could move to other places where those would not be limiting. Sorry? But we can't do without those three. Now, you can think of hunger in a world where food was really limited as being something that might have been inevitable. But in the 21st century, we are in the most remarkable phase of history in that hunger occurs not because it has to, because we create it. As a Roman Catholic as well, I often think of God as a God of abundance. And so if we have shortages, they tend to be man-made. They're not inflicted on us. Now, hunger is also interesting from a variety of perspectives. One can describe it physiologically. What you feel when you haven't eaten for a number of hours. That drive that you have to go open a refrigerator or seek food, you can measure. There are physiological, objective, empirical things you can do to assess it. But the play was speaking about that hunger and other hungers that Foe has addressed in a variety of ways. And we can think about a hunger for love or a hunger for companionship. And food has some of that, less tangible. And in the US, where we recognize there is hunger, there was a great need a number of years ago to determine how we were going to measure it. Not hunger in the physiological sense, because we could do that, but hunger in the social sense of what is it that's driving individuals to the food kitchens and other places. Because if you measured it physiologically, generally when you have physiological hunger that's chronic, people begin to waste away. You don't see wasting in developed societies. But that doesn't mean that people aren't hungry, because the hunger has a social dimension. And so that we define hunger as those situations where individuals are not able to secure adequate, wholesome food in socially acceptable ways. In a society such as ours, not being able to assure food security really is a scandal. So how is it measured? Well, there were some investigators throughout the country that came up with some very novel ways of doing it. And they all centered around the strategies that families use to be able to assure that in fact there would be enough food. And so what sort of strategies did they use? Simple things. Sending your kids to visit the neighbors during lunchtime. Trying to, as was done, I think, by one of the recordings that we heard, the mother not eating to make sure that in fact the dad and the child had food first. Trying to make sure that in fact you stretch that food dollar, and watching to see whether or not in communities, as paychecks were running out, if attendance at soup kitchens was going up. And when we define hunger in that way, we find that it's increasing in the US rather than decreasing. We don't understand the full dynamics of it, but that in fact it's real. Now, if you look at it from an international perspective, you find both varieties, the sort of social context, socially defined hunger that we tend to see in the US, but also the physiological type that can be quite pernicious and quite damaging, particularly to children. You know, I was once, as a biologist, I was the only biologist at a meeting at the World Food Program. We were trying to convince governments that it was really necessary to extend the amount of aid we were providing to be able to deal with the biological imperative of hunger. And I was the only biologist in the meeting. Everybody else was either a banker or a planning minister. And I had about 10 minutes or 15 minutes, I think, to convince them about how important hunger was. And I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do it other than in biological terms. Then I had a flash. I said, well, I'm going to describe it from a banker's perspective. And I said, think of the needs of a child as a payment schedule. I said, and Mother Nature is the most unforgiving banker I know. She doesn't know the term debt abatement. You can either pay now or you can pay later, and you pay with interest. I said, conversely, she's also the most generous of bankers, because if you meet your payment schedule, the outcomes are wonderful. Go to your own homes. Look at your kids and your grandkids. They're great. We know how to make healthy children. And among the ingredients is a wholesome, healthy, nutritious food supply. And so that when a child needs vitamin A or iron or zinc, you have to be there with it. And one of the tragedies is that hunger, although it's an acute phenomenon in terms of meeting that schedule of payments, also has some very chronic effects. And we now know that the effects of hunger, especially in childhood, are long-lasting, so that they create then a social imperative. Because in fact, the outcome of not meeting those needs are long-lasting, not only to the individual, but the communities in which they live. So we're faced with the sorts of things that the playwright was trying to put together, not only the acute situation that we're seeing, but also the chronic effects of not meeting those needs can present. More dramatic still now, as science moves forward, is that we're beginning to understand that if you go from a situation of want to a situation of excess, then you increase the likelihood of some very severe illnesses in populations. So that now what we're experiencing in the third world is quite paradoxical. Not only have they had to deal with problems of hunger, but as their economies have improved, as excess is provided, we seem to be increasing the risk they run to a variety of chronic diseases, so that now in the third world, more people are dying because of food-related diseases than they are from infectious diseases. And so the whole issue of hunger, when it occurs, how it's addressed, is becoming increasingly complex and yet exceedingly simple, because we know how to solve it. It's totally preventable. And the play, I think, did a marvelous job of showing us one face of hunger, sort of that social justice phase. But keep in mind that there has some very deep-rooted effects biologically as well, and so that the impacts are real and not just uncomfortable in the sense that the play presents. So let's hear your questions as well.
Good, thank you very much. I'm going to ask one question and then we'll open it to the floor. We who were in the audience were surrounded by some extra, slightly inanimate, but good-sized companions, and they remain among us now, as well as by a series of billboards that encourage food consumption. One of the things that came up for me that I was totally oblivious about in getting ready for today is there's a relationship between hunger and obesity. And I'm wondering, I think each of you have dealt with that in your respective professions, and I wonder if you could address that. What is the relationship between hunger and obesity?
Would you like to go first?
Well, let me give you the physiological perspective.
Okay.
Brian, Ellen to give you the more social. Physiologically, I mean, what appears to be happening in bringing both together is changes that occur in early life in situations of want that appear to predispose individuals to obesity. So that now we're seeing obesity rising, certainly very rapidly in the U.S., but it's increasing even more rapidly in developing countries because of those perinatal events that are physiologically grounded. And we were in a biology class, we could go through what are termed the epigenetic changes that seem to be bringing that about. But there's also a dimension that's physiological but socioeconomic, in that today it's quite easy to get a diet that is excessive in energy because carbohydrate calories and fat calories have become very cheap. And paradoxically, when in fact you're not food secure, then you're going to try to stretch your food dollar. And the most effective way you can do it is with foods that are calorie dense, nutrient poor, and then you have that excess in contexts that are limiting in terms of physical activity, and so there you promote obesity, not only because of the sort of perverse impacts on satiety that simple sugars and fats have that have become increasingly inexpensive and therefore increasingly accessible, and the growing inaccessibility of foods that are less calorically dense and in many ways much healthier. So it's socioeconomic, it's rooted in want in early life, and oftentimes when these two come together, then they produce the most pernicious outcomes.
Well, I would say that, to the extent that obesity has become metabolized and it's now defined as an epidemic, that poor people are not particularly any more obese than middle-class people. I speak from experience. I think that there are issues in poor communities that make it hard for kids. I think in poor communities that have, if the streets are dangerous, mothers tend to make their kids stay inside. If there's nothing to do outside, kids tend to stay inside. I think advertising plays an enormous role in kids across the board eating wrong foods and eating too much. I think USDA is culpable. The food pyramid is never defined as kind of really good, nutritious foods. It's defined in a much broader way. So I mean, I know it's sort of the fashion now to talk about obesity. I think that the real issue for low-income people who are hungry is really an absence of micronutrients. I'm not trying to take your part on the panel because it's like the only one biological fact I know. But my great dear friend Ron Kleinman, who's a pediatrician at Mass General Hospital and a colleague of Bert's, has said to me so many times, it doesn't matter if kids are fat or if they're thin. If they're not getting the micronutrients they need, they're not going to have the capacity to learn that they would have if they were fed correctly. And it's, it's really as simple as that. That the issue really is good food, good nutrition, and hunger isn't just an emptiness. I mean, I think we often think about poor people being hungry and there's this emptiness and they can just take anything. Our old food we'll give to poor people. But the truth is that what we want to do is give people the same sort of nutrient-dense food that we want to give ourselves. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's kind of roundabout way.
And a micronutrient is?
Things like iron,
So glad you
Say
followed up on that, 'cause I would have no idea.
folate, everything that's not almost everything, but it's not even the protein that you eat in your diet or a fat. But just to give you a sense of the point that, important point that Ellen in terms of advertising and what we do to our kids, think of taking the equivalent of a soft drink. Now, what would happen to each of you if you took just one soft drink more than you needed every day in terms of your energy needs? How much time do you think a child would have to exercise in order to use up the energy in one soft drink? Are there any estimates in the audience? 20 minutes? 30 minutes?
2 hours.
2 hours. And you'd have to walk at a rate of about 4 miles an hour. No, now 4 miles in an hour is a good, steady clip. Now, if you just accumulate those approximately 200 calories every day in about, a month, gain about a little bit over a pound of fat. Do that every month. And it's not difficult to understand why. In fact, those imbalances that you alluded to in terms of not being in the playground. And so it's a combination of both, of the pushing of food, as we see this marvelously done around you, and the lack of activity. But if I'm going to have a choice in what I'm going to push, if we're really concerned about obesity, not the other important issues that relate to hunger, what's going to be easier? For me to get a kid to exercise vigorously for 2 hours every day so they can have that extra Coca-Cola, or substitute some water for the soft drink.
Let's open the floor. There are questions from you folks that you'd like to put to the panelists? Yes, John.
How do you determine, when I got into the play, it was how do you determine what hunger is? Nutritional hunger, as a spiritual hunger, other aspects. But how do you, because I was going through and reading statistics about people being hungry, and the USDA has their set of statistics, and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare have their set of statistics, and somehow they can't meet and determine what causes hunger or what really hunger is. But what is hunger? Is there a way to empiricize hunger? And do we then know how many people are hungry? And then there's that's one issue. And then there's the issue that, like, these people are working people. They work for a living, and they can't feed themselves. I mean, is that a very prevalent condition in the United States? People who work for a living, have full-time jobs, and still can't afford to feed themselves, as it says.
I'll let Ellen describe what the causes of the type of hunger.
I was hoping you would describe the measure.
I can see how we measure it. John. And right now, we're estimating that there are about 13.5 million. I checked the web before leaving us here, see what the latest numbers were. And that there are about 13.5 million households in the U.S. that describe themselves as being insecure. So that 88% are food secure, 12% are food insecure. Now, food insecurity can exist with or without hunger in the physiological sense. And physiologically, people that are food insecure and hungry number about 4% of households in the United States. And in those individuals, what you normally see are one of two things. You see weight loss, because in order to be physiologically hungry, your intake has to be less than what you need. So that the only way you can make up the difference is by burning body tissues and losing weight. That's why weight loss diets work. You have to take in less than what you consume. Now, the other 7% of the population is not described as hungry. They're food insecure. And that's described by asking individuals about how they cope with, or how they answer questions like, is there enough food in the house for you to always eat so that you're never hungry? And what sort of things do you do then to cope because you don't have enough food in the house? And there are a series of 8 or 9 questions the government uses to come up with statistics. And depending on how they answer those questions on surveys, then we try to extrapolate from those who is hungry and food insecure, and who is food insecure without hunger. Now for me, whether you're food insecure with hunger or food insecure without hunger, that it still is a basic hunger in the social context that I described, and it has other perverse outcomes, one of which, in this country at least, is obesity, for reasons that we don't understand very well. But it's done by surveys. It's now part of the census. We now keep statistics on the proportions of households that are food insecure with or without hunger. It's done on an ongoing basis so that we can better understand whether we're ameliorating the problem or whether it's getting worse. And as I mentioned earlier, actually, there's been about an increase from about 8 to 10%, relatively speaking, in the last 2 or 3 years. So that there are increasing proportions of people in the U.S. that are food insecure, many of them children. In fact, a disproportionate number are young families.
So I'm going to do what politicians do sometimes and answer your question with the answer I want to answer it with, which doesn't exactly address your question, but I think it's important. When we think about hunger as a justice issue, in a very real and tangible way, hunger is a kind of inequality that low-income children face. And I say that to preface my answer, kind of, to your question, which is, I think you're also asking who's hungry and where are they. At least I'm hoping you're asking that. And I have an answer for that. In Massachusetts, one of the sort of the go-arounds we had with state government over a couple of years was the governor at the time, and I won't mention who it was, would say that hunger wasn't an issue in Massachusetts because, after all, we were after Connecticut, a state that was among the least hungry in the country. And I always knew, I just knew in my gut that wasn't really telling the right story. And so a couple of years ago, we got some money to do some really interesting survey research using the measurement, the food insecurity measurement, which is pretty much nationally used right now. And what we did is, rather than measuring the state as a whole, what we did is we went into low-income communities and asked that question. So what you saw is, you'd see, if you look at are Massachusetts children hungry, any child is hungry is a problem, but you'd see, not a terribly disturbing number. However, when you went into, and we've actually reported on this, and if you're really interested, you can get all this on the website, but when we went into low-income communities like Fall River and Lowell and Lawrence and parts of Boston and parts of Cape Cod, when we went into the poverty census tract districts, we found that 33% of the kids lived in families who lived in homes where their families struggled to put food on the table. And that kind of, for us, encompassed both families that literally ran out of food, as well as families who sort of ran out of food at the end of the month, using that standardized measure, but kind of explaining it in a way that people found a little bit easier to understand. So the implications of 33% of the children in our state, in low-income communities, living in food insecure families means that those kids don't learn as well. I mean, they just don't learn as well. And I mean, it's just like a fact. It means that they get sick more often and that their recovery time is slower. That is just a fact. And so when we think about justice and injustice, how incredibly unjust is that we have children in this state who, because they live in families who don't have enough money to buy food, that we're like missing the surgeons of tomorrow. We're missing like the actors of tomorrow. We're missing all the kids who can't be what they should have been, but if they had food. And part of Project Bread's response to those issues and sort of our solution from the justice perspective is really creating systems that prevent hunger among kids. So for example, we've taken a lead in providing universal school breakfast for kids in low-income communities and have been very successful. And then there's a variety of other things, but the answer to who's hungry, I mean, I think that it's a serious issue, and I think that we used to think of it as a moral issue, and there were very few people who understood as much as you did early on that hunger really, really damaged children's lives. It really, literally damages their future. And as such, it's an issue of inequality, it's an issue of justice, it's not an issue of morality or charity. And that's just what I think. So I have a little convoluted answer to your question.
I'm Crystal, I'm the set designer, and when John and I were first making this project happen, one of our goals was to make the audience feel uncomfortable with the idea, like to make them part of it, to really sort of involve them in a way instead of having a safe distance from what was happening. And part of these images are, were about that. I was wondering, this is more a question of your perception when you came into this room. Did any of that come across, or do you think the audience, we kind of didn't want to let the audience off the hook. Do you think any of the audience will leave now carrying some of that with them? Were we successful there? How did you feel about what was here?
Well, you were successful in me because at the end of this little piece of theater, I said to myself, you are just not radical enough, Ellen. I mean, that there are just more radical solutions to this. And, and I really had that thought. I mean, it just, because it was so good, in the end was so powerful, and so true. I mean, so filled with truth, that was my reaction.
And for me, I thought how sophisticated. Now, I'll tell you why, because maybe I extrapolated too much. There's really one. But on the one hand, most of the images were of plenty. And so I thought, how do we morally defend the fact that there are people hungry in today's world amid plenty? But the other was the connection, because there are risks that individuals without the same socioeconomic resources that most of us enjoy appear to be at greater risk to obesity for a variety of complex problems that have to go to neighborhoods and the sorts of foods they can afford, and the sort of interpersonal dynamics and how food is handled in those contexts. And that you were also trying to make a statement about that in fact you could be hungry and also overweight, which bothers many of our politicians. And so that was my reaction. Gee, theater really got it. I mean,
Once in a while, yeah. There's a question back here, sir?
Actually, a couple of questions. One is if, actually, the place obviously very political, has a tremendous political message, economic, social political message. And so I have two questions. One is obviously hunger is a very important problem in this country. Why is it at the forefront of a political discussion? That's my first question. And the second one is, to what extent do you think that the
that part because I'm not the international expert. I'd say it's not a front burner issue in part because it's seen as an individual problem that lends itself to a charitable solution. It's not seen as a systems problem. That's what I think.
Can I say
The
something?
rest of it is yours.
I'd like to say something about that.
Yeah.
My name is Pam Newton, and I worked with homeless veterans for 7 years as a psychotherapist on an inpatient unit in Bedford. And I find it and found it so incredibly difficult to stay with the reality of the amount of homelessness, the amount of hunger, the amount of inequality, injustice, of stereotyping the people who are poor or different than the mainstream, that at a certain point I couldn't do it anymore. I left my job after 7 years. I do other things besides that. But I think that I'm not unusual. I stayed longer than any other staff member actually on the unit. That it's so painful when you're actually looking at this stuff, so that it's very easy just to deny it and wipe it out of your mind. Personally.
And internationally, the issue is often geopolitical in the sense of war. The international community has been increasingly successful in getting food aid to people in acute emergencies. I mean, we see this on our television screens. But now, many people are asking a very perverse question. Are we making war more attractive?
That's fascinating. It's so interesting.
Because it's remediable?
Because in fact, people are not suffering enough. And we protract them through that response. It's a very controversial. And so now people are asking, gee, has the food aid situation exacerbated the problem for all the wrong reasons? My answer to that is no. I mean, that in fact, there are other ways you can prevent war other than by making people hungry. But there is that point of view, and it's important that I share it with you. The major cause is socioeconomic, and the growing gap that there exists between those of us that enjoy the type of lifestyle that we have here and in the rest of the developed world versus the rest of the world. And we're becoming a shrinking minority. And as we become fewer and fewer in number and control a greater proportion of resources, that instability is going to grow. And so many of us have made the argument that if you really are worried about national security, that in fact you have to make sure that in fact these sorts of gaps are narrowed. And that again, perversely enough, it has nothing to do with you being a good person or magnanimous or charitable, that it's in our self-interest to make this happen. Not only because then you have better outcomes in terms of people's health, their productivity, but because of the important point that you've made, that you will decrease that instability which seems to be growing on a geopolitical basis.
Well, I'm going to ask what maybe the last question, but it makes me think of this other question I have. You said that we create hunger as a society, as a culture, as a nation, whatever. Hunger is not something that happens. Hunger is something that we do. So why do we do hunger? What function or purpose does it serve?
Within the U.S., let me rephrase it. Within the UN system, there are now increasing voices that say that we should recognize the right to food. Now that has all sorts of economic, political ramifications. Many countries are saying, yes, that's correct. That as an international community, there is no reason why anyone on this planet should go hungry. There is one country that is staunchly opposed to that idea, that humans have a right to food. Guess which one it is?
That is so disgusting. Isn't that awful?
Now, why is that?
That's just awful.
It's horrible. I mean, I think it's horrible. Now, why is that?
Yeah.
Because George Bush is president.
and many people in positions of power feel that if we were to guarantee the right to food, then that you would lose the incentive for the capitalist system, and that you undermine it, and that therefore that, if you're poor, you deserve to be poor. I mean, it's that outdated and I think discredited philosophy of blaming the victim, when in actuality the socioeconomic dynamics that we set up often make this an outcome. The trade, I hate to get too technical, probably our trade policy and the fact that we protect farmers in the U.S. Many of us think, for example, that food aid in the U.S. is something the U.S. does because we're generous people. Well, in the view of some of us, it's because it's a welfare program for states like South Dakota and North Dakota and the breadbasket, because we buy the food from them at U.S. prices and then we give it to the rest of the world. I'm not sure, when we try to get the U.S. government to monetize that program, so we give people the cash to be able to buy the food locally and grow it locally, and we stop the subsidies, I've argued that we ought to continue supporting rural America. Just don't support them in the way we do by paying them to grow crops and keep world prices artificially low because of the fact that we're paying other people artificially high prices. There are a number of people that have argued that we could prevent much of this, much hunger, if Europe, at least the trade issue is not just an American issue, if Europe, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, a number of countries that produce food surpluses would in fact stop the subsidies we now provide those agricultural systems, and indeed then make it much more profitable for farmers in the third world to get even more food, feed not only themselves but the rest of the world. It's a complex answer.
There's a couple questions here, yeah. Megan?
One of the final moments of the play, there's an actor that comes out and says, I'm sure you're all smiling and laughing in the audience because this is not your problem. And I think that Boston College does a really good job of stretching the message of like men and women for others and whatnot. But I still think that there is a large part of this community on campus and whatnot that kind of turns their head to what's going on beyond this BC bubble and what's going on in Boston and Massachusetts and the U.S. as a whole. And so I was just wondering, what can we do, or like making students more aware of like what goes on off campus, and knowing that this is not my personal problem, but it's something that I can do or help or like be more aware of.
I've only been at BC for about 4 months now. And not to be patronizing to those of you that have been here for a much longer period of time, I'm amazed at how much more aware this campus is than most campuses in terms of understanding that in fact we're not the only ones on this planet, that we share it with many other human beings. Could we do more? Certainly I think we could do more, and I would hope that in the next 5 years that we're going to be able to do yet more. But when I say we, it's all the alums as well as students here, that in fact I hope it's not something that we only do here in this bubble and that the awareness is confined, because I do think that a lot of our students are aware of what's going on in the rest of the world, at least in my limited discussions with a few students. I don't know yet, because I haven't met enough alums to know if that message takes. After we leave, we continue that commitment. Whether you're a major in chemistry or in physics or in literature or in nursing or in law school or the School of Management, that in fact, regardless of what your role is, that message took and the choices that we made further the improvement of the human condition. So even though it's inadequate, it's much better than in most places that I've experienced.
What about
I also want to say BC plays an extraordinarily important role in the life of Massachusetts and Boston. I mean, I just know that because I work with lots and lots I had breakfast last Thursday morning with Tommy O'Neill, Nielsen, and he was talking about ways that he could involve some of his BC connections in Project Red. I mean, Jack Connors, I mean, the list is really like endless. BC has an enormous impact on the life of Massachusetts and Boston. I'm sure it has a big impact nationally, but I can tell you for sure that what you learn here and who you are is extraordinarily important in Massachusetts. Of course you can do better, we can all do better, but I think you just play an incredibly important role, and BC is really one of the top schools, in my view, for social justice and social awareness. We can always be better, but we can all be better.
You can't be satisfied if you can't fill the gaps.
We have time for one more.
Actually, this isn't a question, it was a comment. My name is Michelle Sturtberg, and I work in the Pulse program on campus. And Ellen, first I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to provide our Pulse students to serve at Project Red.
We have BC students who work at Project Red. They're fantastic. We love them.
But in terms of concrete things that people could do, I just wanted to mention that if anybody here was interested in doing service at Project Red, feel free to stop by the Pulse office and we can help connect you to that opportunity. And also wanted to mention the Walk for Hunger, which Ellen talked about a few minutes ago, is coming up soon. And we just got our mailing on Friday from Project Red, so we have lots of brochures in our office. If you're interested in participating in that. So we're over McElroy, and feel free to stop by if you'd like to get more connected to Project Red.
Thanks, that little plug. For the Walk for Hunger, we're always so desperate for walk teams. It's hard to get 40,000 people every year. It's like, yeah, thank you so much. And I actually have, I'm not sure if there'll be like a run on these, but this is this is our copy of a report on hunger in Massachusetts. If anybody's interested, if somehow we run out, this is also on our website, or you can just sign up in your program, or just ask me, just give me your address and I'll send you more.
This production opened on Wednesday night, this past Wednesday, a few days ago, and at the breakfast table on Thursday, I was reading the paper and found this article that says, Food Bank Network served 25 million in 2005. It's the report from America's Second Harvest, and mentions things, John, that something over 1/3 of the people of those 25 million are households with jobs in it. And so I was cutting it out, obviously, to bring it today, and then I noticed the article right below it, which was just too ironic for words. It was the article about the winners of the Powerball lottery in Iowa, I believe. So Meat Workers Prize isn't chopped liver, and it's 6 or 8 people who worked in all places in a meat packing plant in Iowa, and won the largest lottery in American history. And one of them, a man named Quang Dao, who was 56 years old, came to the United States in 1988 from Vietnam, where he still has family. And his quote here is, "This is a great country." And these two things together, I couldn't help but put them together somehow. I hope you'll join me in thanking